ghost is dead. The bats have left the bell tower. The victims have been bled. That velvet lines the black box. Bela Lugosi is dead.
Greetings. I bid you welcome to the Venomous Vampire Horror Podcast. I am your immortal hostess, Velvet. Together, we'll be learning about, or otherwise just discussing, the classic and staple horror films that I watch, and at the end of each episode, I will give my personal rating of 0 to 5 bats. I wanted to start my very first episode off with the 1931 Universal Dracula because it's my favorite classic horror movie, and I always have a lot to say on the topic of Dracula and vampires in general, as you can probably guess from the name of my podcast. So let's begin. On February 14th, 1931, that's right, Valentine's Day, 1931, Dracula came to the big screen. It was the first horror talkie that Universal ever put out, and in general, I believe. So this was quite a big deal. There was actually 3 versions of Dracula that were released in theaters at the same time. There was the English version starring Bela Lugosi, there was the Spanish version, and there was actually a silent film version for potential viewers who were just a little put off by the fact that they were talking, I guess. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting background lore with the making of this movie, actually. So originally they wanted, I think, Lon Chaney to be Dracula, but Bela Lugosi had been Dracula on the Broadway stage play for years already, and he fought like tooth and nail to get that role, and he was like the only person who took the role seriously besides Dwight Frye, which I don't think Dwight Frye was beside him on stage as Renfield. He might have been. I don't know for sure. I know Edward Van Sloan was Van Helsing on stage with him. And Van Sloan apparently did not have high regard for the film. Neither did really anyone else in it. They all kind of thought it was stupid, but Bela Lugosi really put his all into his performance. He was a method actor, but like not in a cringe Suicide Squad Jared Leto Joker way, where he's like drinking people's blood for real or anything. He was just like prancing around being like, I am Dracula, you know. And maybe they thought that was weird at the time, but I think he was just having, you know, a grand old time and being a really cool guy. Now, what's so amazing to me about how the people involved with Dracula, at least like most of them, just did not give 2 shits about what they were involved with, and they really thought it was stupid, is that it's become such a classic and just a cultural monument of horror and vampire fiction, and like it's been preserved in the Library of Congress, both the original 1897 novel by Bram Stoker and the 1931 film. So Dracula as a character and as a piece of horror fiction, it's so beloved now. It's impossible for me to imagine theater goers being like, oh, what is this, you know, in the 30s, or even really the actors themselves. I can't imagine them not appreciating what they're a part of, but I do get that the Universal era is very campy and cheesy, and that's part of why I love it so much, but I guess you can't really predict gold when you've struck it. One criticism you could have is that there is a very clear shift in terms of quality of the story and of the film, and tone really, from the beginning to the end. The beginning of the movie is just very eerie and atmospheric, and it's incredible. There's these just really well lit shots of Bela Lugosi and his eerie smile and haunting eyes, and every line he says is just iconic and so memorable, and like none of them are from the book. I assume these are all taken from the play, but when we think of Dracula, we think of like, I never drink wine. And that was never even written by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker did not think of that. But Bela Lugosi said it, and we're like, that's Dracula. But I'm getting ahead of myself. as the movie proceeds, it gets a little campy. You get Renfield's transformation from this charming young businessman, this little realtor, to becoming this crazed maniac who laughs like this, ha 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 ha, and he's just wild, and he eats bugs, and of course, that's Renfield in the book and in any adaptation. But Renfield really made the movie for me the first time I watched it, and I'm not sure. I love Dwight Frye's performance. I think Dwight Frye was also very much typecast. Bela Lugosi was continuously typecast as like villains and vampires and things after this movie, but Dwight Frye was continuously typecast as like weird sidekicks and just crazy guys because he just couldn't escape this. But he made the movie for me with some of his lines like, "Flies? Who wants to eat flies? Not when I can eat nice fat spiders." He's just crazy. So there's him, and there's just there's some interesting exchanges between David Manners as Jonathan Harker and Helen Chandler as Mina, when she's becoming a vampire, and Jonathan is concerned about her, and he's like, "Your eyes, they look at me so strangely." And it's just very cheesy, a lot of things are very silly and stupid, and it gets sillier and stupider as the movie goes on. And I mean, even in the beginning, things are silly and stupid, but it also just has this amazing quality to it, and this amazing sense of heart to it, of like, this is what horror is supposed to be. It's like atmospheric and chilling, and it gives you a little bit of imagination because I mean, it was pre-Hays Code. Actually, I couldn't even say because it was a code film. No, it was pre-code. And yeah, it was just so well done for the time, I think. I don't know, I can find flaw with it, but I can't find reason to just hate on it when it is such a wonderful movie that makes me so happy. So I've been talking about Dracula without explaining the basic premise of Dracula for those who don't know. I'm sorry, this is my first episode. I will try to be better. Anyways, so Dracula basically follows a realtor coming to Transylvania from England to help the titular vampire move in search of new blood. He becomes Dracula's familiar and then is thrown into a sanitarium, which is run by Dr. Seward. Dr. Seward in this adaptation is the main female character, Mina's father. And Mina is staying with her friend Lucy, or rather Lucy is staying with her. Dracula preys on Lucy a little bit first, and Lucy becomes a vampire, and she starts preying on children, which becomes a problem. And then Dracula begins preying on Mina, and then that brings everything to Dr. Seward and Mina's fiance Jonathan's attention, because they're like, oh god, not Mina. So they contact Van Helsing, who I believe is a friend and past colleague of Dr. Seward, in the book at least. I don't know. And so Van Helsing comes, and he's like, hey, I know about vampires, and we're dealing with a vampire. And so Van Helsing guides everyone to kill Lucy, and then to find Dracula and kill him, and thus free Mina from the chance of ever becoming a vampire. And that is the basic premise of Dracula, really. The ending of the movie is pretty underwhelming, admittedly. In the book, there's just this amazing battle, and there's just all this turmoil to get to Dracula's castle, and once you finally kill him, he turns to dust, and it's like, oh, finally this evil has been triumphed. But in the movie, it's just kind of like, they stake his wives, and they stake him, and then Mina's like, and then it just kind of ends, And I do appreciate that the ending was so open-ended that Renfield 2023 kind of made sense. Like, they kind of made it to where, or well, not kind of, they made it to where Dracula survived all these numerous attacks from vampire hunters and from Van Helsing, and Renfield always patched him up, and they survived. And I accept this. I accept Renfield as a canon continuation because it was made by Universal, and I actually really, really enjoy the little intro bit where they recreated scenes from the 1931 Dracula. I thought it was very special. I will say that spoiler alert, Dracula is just a 5 out of 5 for me, and Renfield is like a 3 out of 5 for me, because it had a lot of fun, and it was a lot of fun, but I could not really get behind Aquafina's performance. I'm sorry. Oh yes, I was gonna talk about book to movie changes, which isn't that important, but for some reason they did this a lot with the Universal monster movies that were adapted from books, or Universal horror in general, really. Um, so in the novel, Jonathan is Dracula's realtor, and Renfield is a separate character who is also Dracula's familiar, but it's basically just entirely consequential or inconsequential of how he became his familiar or anything. I actually really prefer the way it's done in the movie because I think it kind of fleshes Renfield out, but I know that in the novel, Renfield's character is very much a commentary on, like, you know, a mentally ill man being taken advantage of, and how scary that would be, you know, to be not believed because of your history of insanity, and to know fully well that you're telling the truth about this supernatural force, you know? So that's very frightening. But in the movie, it's more like, you know, he was completely sane once, and then he changed because Dracula did something to him. And Jonathan is always played as the straight man in the movie, whereas, you know, in the book, he witnessed the horrors of Dracula's castle, and he would not be saying, "Come along, Mina." He would be saying, "Mina, let's get out of here and run away because Dracula's just around the corner." um, but also, Lucy has 3 suitors in the book: Arthur Holmwood, Quincy Morris, and Dr. Seward. Dr. Seward is not Mina's father in the book. He's just some guy that owns a sanitarium and wants to marry Lucy. And Lucy picks Arthur, but all 3 of the guys remain very close friends, and they all love her very dearly, to the point it's kind of like they're in a polycule. Um, and it's just really funny, actually. In the book, they all give Lucy blood transplants, and including Van Helsing, and then Arthur's like, "Oh, my blood runs through her veins. It's like she's my wife, even though we're not married." And Van Helsing's like, I guess we're all married to her then." Oh, I very much meant transfusion, not transplant. So, what I really want to talk about now is how the 1931 Dracula really shaped some of the most popular vampire tropes, and the behavioral mannerisms of vampires, and also the familiar archetype that Renfield embodies. So, for starters, Bela Lugosi just absolutely embodies the Dracula role. Um, he was Hungarian, so, you know, he lived nearby Romania, and Dracula is Transylvanian, and he has the accent, he has the pause and all of that, and I feel like I don't know that we would have that idea of a vampire without Dracula, much less without Bela Lugosi's portrayal. If we had Lon Chaney doing Dracula, we wouldn't think of this cool foreign guy being a vampire. We would just think of some dude, you know? The way he holds his hands up and kind of lurks around, almost very cat-like, and this kind of like silent but deadly. That's not the right terminology. This just like silent stalker. um I feel like all of these archetypes he really embodied and helped to make the mainstream portrayal of a vampire or what Dracula should be. Like, you know that Christopher Lee, even though he says he didn't like Bela Lugosi's Dracula, it's like, okay, then why is your hair slicked back and why are you in that tuxedo and that cape? Like, okay. And then on the topic of Renfield, it's just everything about his portrayal in the movie is so eccentric and flamboyant and all over the place. And not all familiars are usually like that. It's really just Renfield. Like, to be fair, when I think of a familiar character, I do think of Renfield. And I think of Renfield syndrome, you know, the medical condition of desiring human blood. Because Renfield, his thing was that he wanted to consume small amounts of blood from animals and insects because he wanted to be a vampire like Dracula, but I don't think he had the chops to really be eating people. So he just wanted some rats. But you know, otherwise I just think of, you know, a character like Guillermo from What We Do in the Shadows, who of course his life's goal is to be a vampire. And this was also sort of explored with him, where he became one and then he just couldn't deal with it. Spoilers for What We Do in the Shadows. And I think that's very much a Renfield kind of thing, where you want what you can't have, but then you can't handle it, or you're not made for it. So the vampires just take advantage of you and keep you running in a loop. I feel that the idea of a servant that helps a vampire or a monster or whatever, that's very much started with Renfield. I think Renfield was the start of that. And I'm glad he was, you know, because Renfield, like I already said in this, really makes Dracula for me. If you're not focusing on Bela Lugosi, you're gonna be focusing on Dwight Frye, because his performance is literally insane. It's impossible to ignore. Like, even in the 1930s, there was probably a few people like cracking up in the theater at Renfield, because it's impossible not to find it funny, in my opinion. Not it, him. But anyway, yeah. And of course, like, these traits, I'm sure, are very ingrained into the characters even outside of the film, you know. But I still feel like the film is so iconic and so responsible for our perception of vampires and anything associated with vampires. The vampire emoji is Dracula, you know? So that's such a stupid, modern, just absolutely vile, makes me want to vomit thing to say, like, oh, the vampire emoji. But, like, it's true, you know? Everything to do with vampires is so inspired by Dracula. And that's also fascinating, because what we believe was the inspiration for Dracula was Carmilla, which was Sheridan Le Fanu's lesbian novella, basically. And Carmilla was from Styria, and yeah, so there's some differences, and a lot of differences, you know, from everything I just said. It's a much shorter book. It's about a female vampire who mostly preys on female humans, and it's a great book, but there wasn't really an adaptation of that movie until like the 70s from Hammer. I'm talking about The Vampire Lovers, which is a great film. But you can also argue that 1936 they kind of tackled the lesbian vampire debacle with Dracula's daughter and Countess Maria Zaleska, who preys on females as well. But yeah, Bram Stoker was supposedly inspired by Carmilla, but then there's also another vampire story, I believe, that was just simply called The Vampire, that, if I'm not mistaken, was written in the same horror writing competition in the 1800s that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in. So that's really fun. I am once more going so very much off the rails. Um, I want to go back to the original 1931 Dracula. Um, so let's talk about that. Bela Lugosi was, well, there's some mixed reports. I've heard that he was not happy to be typecast, that he was like, after this movie, that's it, no more Dracula. But then he did go on to play a vampire in Mark of the Vampire, or, well, a human pretending to be a vampire, but I digress. And, he was a vampire in another movie. And, he was in Plan 9 from Outer Space. He had some scenes of prancing around in a cape for Ed Wood, which, him and Ed Wood were besties, so whatever. But I also hear that he would, wear the costume for trick-or-treaters, and that, it was still a part of his personal brand, and I guess he maybe accepted it at some point, and I would like to believe that he did, because Dracula is so important to us horror fans and to me as a fan of vampires and horror, and Bela Lugosi is such an iconic classic actor, and all the Universal actors had their little nickname, and he was just Bela Dracula Lugosi. And for someone to be that so tied to their role that he was even buried in his cape, it would be so depressing, so mind-blowingly depressing to think that he didn't enjoy it even a tiny bit. So I have to believe that, it was maybe his choice, or if it wasn't his choice, that he's, made peace with it in the afterlife. Although we do know that he is undead. But I digress. And that's another thing. Wasn't his grave was like found empty or something? I don't know. I could be making that up. But he was buried in the Cape, and I do think that's like beautiful. Like, if I was Bela Lugosi, I would want to be buried in the Cape, but I mean, I can't speak for him. And at the same time, it's like, would I want to have been buried with, like, well, it was his greatest accomplishment. He did so much for film and for horror and for literature, like, because Dracula is such an iconic book, and that's the most iconic film adaptation. I don't know. Bela Lugosi is awesome, okay? Like, we really appreciate what he did with Dracula. At least I do. And, no matter the case there, I mean, he's dead, rest in peace, and hopefully he was happy with how things were dealt with. I do think it's very nice that his family and his estate keeps up his legacy, and collaborates and makes merchandise and Dracula things still. It's very nice. Now, I was talking about Renfield 2023 earlier, and so I would like to segue into talking about Last Voyage of the Demeter, just in a general Dracula discussion, I guess. That movie is based on a chapter in the book about where Dracula is aboard the Demeter, which is the ship that is transporting him from Transylvania to England. And basically, he transforms into a wolf and, like, mauls people to stay alive. Or, at night he comes out and drinks people's blood, and, very scary stuff. And then the ship comes to England, and there was no survivors. And that's how he got there. And the movie is just that chapter. It's just a slasher about the voyagers of the Demeter being taken out one by one by Count Dracula. Now, the Dracula that they went for was not a Lugosi Dracula. It was more of a Max Schreck, Count Orlok kind of Dracula. But I wouldn't even compare it to Count Orlok, really. It was just kind of like this weird fleshy gargoyle thing. And at the end of the movie, he looked pretty cool, like in the top hat with the cane and all that. But he just looked like that at the end. And in the trailer, it seemed very frightening, very scary. But in the movie theater, it just was kind of silly, and it was mediocre. I hate to say it. It was not that good of a movie. And to be fair, the Vesta portion in Dracula 1931 is so stupid. It's literally ship footage from another movie that's like sped up, and then like some newspaper clippings, and then Renfield being like, "We're safe, we made it, master." But that was better than Last Voyage of the Demeter. Like, Dracula in 1931 outsold in every single way. So whoever directed Last Voyage of the Demeter, maybe you should have like a little crazy guy saying some stuff to a coffin, and then maybe I'll walk out of the theater with a smile on my face, because there was just nothing remotely interesting about that. And maybe I'm just like, I'm a little turned off by modern horror. I'm gonna admit it. Like, when I watch a movie that's like a horror movie and it's like crystal clear, I'm like, where's the grain? Like, literally, where's the grain? Like, like, this isn't a horror movie. This isn't a movie in general. This looks too good. This looks like real life. I'm uncomfortable. you know? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I really like the quality of cameras from like the 80s and 90s. And I mean, obviously, like, I'm talking about a film from 31, primarily. I'm talking about a lot of films, apparently. But, yeah, I don't know. Modern horror just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't think it's scarier. I think it's actually worse, because practical effects aren't used. CGI is being used, overused. The scares just aren't as good. Everything's been done before. It's not creative. Sequels galore. I am not a fan of sequels. My mom, this is such a random thing to go on to. My mom, she will be like, "Oh, I want to see a sequel. I want to see the sequel. I wonder what they did with it." And it's like, if it's a horror sequel, they didn't do anything with it, I can tell you that much. At least not since the 80s. Like, in the 80s, there was some good franchises, like, horror sequels in the 80s are great. Horror sequels now, like, do we need Scream 100? I don't know, but we're gonna get it someday. But that was a tangent. Something I am really, really excited for, in regards to remakes, reboots, Dracula-related films and adaptations. It's the new Nosferatu, coming out in December, I believe. Cannot wait for that. And Nicholas Hoult is going to be Thomas Hutter, I think, who was Renfield in the 2023 Renfield. So that's fun that he's making a return for a Dracula thing again. Anyway, I already alluded to this, but Dracula 1931 gets 5 out of 5 bats. It is such a fun movie, even with its flaws, even with its camp humor and nonsense. From start to finish, it is entertaining. It is fast-paced for a movie from 1931. And the actors give their best performances that they could, especially Bela Lugosi, especially Dwight Frye, and especially Edward Van Sloan. And it's just a great movie. It makes me happy. It's my comfort movie. Dracula and Renfield are my comfort characters, as silly as that is. I could talk about Dracula for ages, and, I could talk about all of my favorite scenes and so many things. But I do have to wrap up because I am nearing the end of the episode. I don't know what movie I'm going to be talking about next time. Probably something from the 80s. I do want to talk about, some slashers, and I'm less familiar with the making of these movies from the 80s. I just have a really big interest in Dracula, so I've done some research, for surface level research, but I've done research about, how everyone was feeling and about the production. But for the other movies, I'm just going to be talking about the movies, reviewing the movies, having a grand old time. But this was a special big old first episode of me rambling and kind of figuring things out. So I hope it was okay. I hope it was entertaining. I hope that you enjoyed it and that it made you think and maybe inspired you to sit down and watch Dracula 1931. The tagline was the story of the strangest passion the world has ever known. And maybe it can be your strange passion just like it is mine. So watch Dracula today and enjoy the next episode or something. Okay, bye.